Hello. By the miracles of modern technology, it's very nice to be with you in Taiwan today. My name is Crispin Tucker, and I am the owner and the managing director of a UK company called Professional Language Solutions Limited, or PLS, as we normally refer to ourselves. Today, I'm going to be taking 15 minutes of your time to talk briefly about effective planning for large-scale language training programs for government departments. And particularly, I'm going to be focusing on the question of supply chain models and dynamics within the supply chain. Before we kick off, I'll just give you a little bit of information about my own background. As you can see from the slide, and probably also from my grey hair, I've got 30 years experience of ESP programs, and that is across Europe, across Northern Africa, the Middle East and Asia. As part of that, I and my organisation have partnered in many national workforce development programs. And a very big example of this is that of delivering aviation English for all of the pilots and all of the air traffic controllers in a couple of North African countries. And in terms of working for governments, for each of the last 3 years, my organisation has delivered over 60,000 hours of language training each year for a wide range of diplomats and civil servants from central government departments, and that includes the Home Office, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Cabinet Office and the Departments for Business Innovation and Skills, and many others. In terms of the content of the presentation, I'm firstly going to look at the question of stakeholder dynamics. Then I'm going to turn and look at the question of the structure of supply chains, and I'm going to make reference to a couple of different structures that I'm very familiar with. And lastly, I'm going to try and leave you with some recommendations for your consideration. From this slide about the stakeholder dynamics, you can see that I have divided the stakeholders involved in any language training program into 4 broad categories. Firstly, at the top, you can see we have the sponsors, and that means the purchasing organisation, the customer, they who set the outcomes required and also allocate the budget. Next, going round in a clockwise direction, we have the program managers, and they are responsible for putting in place a specific scope of work and a specific operating procedure. It might be as simple as the individuals who work for the sponsors, but equally it could be an outsourced third party who is responsible for the program management. Next, we have the suppliers. That includes, of course, the training suppliers, but it also includes the suppliers of assessments and tests, and the suppliers of teaching aids and resources, and potentially even of hardware. Last but not least, we have the students. Now, I think the point I want to really make about this is that each of the 4 categories of stakeholder, they all want the same thing. They all want success, but what success looks like for them varies from one to the other. It is not necessarily the same. To give a very brief and obvious example of this, the students all want the same thing. They all want to pass their training. They all want to be successful in their training, and they all want to pass the exam at the end of their training to demonstrate this. However, a supplier of assessments has a slightly different focus. Their focus is on providing accuracy and validity within their examination system. They have much less interested in the actual straightforward numbers of students who pass their exam. They want to make sure they've got a good, reliable exam in place. Another example of a slight conflict of interest, or at least a variance of goals, is that the program managers obviously want to put in place operating procedures which will fulfill the aims of their sponsors. The suppliers may find after a time that they believe that the best interests of their students are served by doing something in a slightly different way, by adapting the scope of work. And therefore, the point that I'd really like to make here is that the way to ensure the success of the programme as a whole is by aligning the goals of all of the categories of stakeholders and trying as far as possible to understand what success looks like for each category. Now turning to look at the actual structure of supply chains. This first slide represents what I've called Model A, which is a supply chain which is based on having multiple simultaneous and parallel contracts. And a good example of this that I'm very familiar with is that of the FCDO, which is the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, part of the UK government. And I'll explain a little bit how their supply chain is structured. Firstly, there is one lead training supplier, who they call the prime provider, and that supplier is given the majority of work and has a coordinating role with the other contract providers. In addition to the prime provider, they then have separate and multiple contracts for what they call centres of excellence, who are each responsible for delivering one specific service. Lastly, in addition to the prime provider and all of the centres of excellence providers, they have a provider who is responsible only for the assessment piece. The strengths of organising the supply chain in this way, I think in the view of the Foreign Office themselves, but certainly in my view, are that it allows the inclusion of specialist organisations that can bring great expertise in one particular field to bear, and yet it still provides a separation between the training and the assessments, ensuring that there is no conflict of interest and helping with the validity of the assessments. To look on the other side of things, the weaknesses of this method, or rather the risks perhaps of this method. Unfortunately, as I'm sure everybody realizes, language training providers often have their own ways of working. They have their own internal practices. And so there may be a lack of conformity between all of the suppliers. And one thing that happens as a result of that is that extensive contract management is required by the customer themselves. So the Foreign Office have a dedicated languages team who work full-time to manage these language contracts, and it is very time-consuming, and it is only really suitable for organisations that have a great deal of expertise in-house within their own staff to provide this contract management. Now we can turn to a different supply chain model, that of one where basically it's structured so that there are multiple competing subcontractors. A good example of this is that of the Defence Academy, which is part of the Ministry of Defence in the UK. The structure here is that the supplier management side of things is entirely outsourced to a third party. They then put in place multiple framework contracts for suppliers who, once they're selected, then compete on a mini bid basis for each and every programme. Once again, just like with the FCDO, the MOD also have an external provider of examinations. Now, the strengths of this structure are that the management burden on the customer is significantly reduced because you have a third party responsible for the supplier management. Also, in theory, because there is a permanent competition internally between the suppliers on the frameworks, there is great motivation on them to keep their game up, and therefore the quality should never slip. Now, the risks, I think, of this structure are that the suppliers are always in direct commercial competition with each other. So even once they're on a framework, they still don't know how much work they're going to get or when it's going to happen. And so the commercial considerations mean they will always try their hardest to win the work. And it might not necessarily be to the overall benefit of the project. In very practical terms, because they don't know when they're going to be having work or which contracts or part of contracts they're going to win, they can't plan ahead, either in terms of allocation of resources or development of product. And that can also have a negative effect on the overall contributions. Having looked at a couple of different examples of the supply chain structure, let me just conclude by making three broad recommendations. Firstly, as both of the examples I've used previously illustrate, I think best practice would show that it's very important to separate the areas of provision that potentially have any conflicts of interest. And a very good example of this is the supply of training and the supply of examinations or assessments. Next, whilst it may seem entirely obvious, I think it's worth pointing out that the ideal supply chain structure has enough suppliers who can cover all of the needs, and it's important to think about what requirements are going to arise in the future as well as what you have currently. But also it's critical that the supply chain is small enough to ensure that the participants can collaborate effectively together. If you have 5,000 different suppliers within the supply chain, there is no way that they are going to be working effectively together. And lastly, try and have key performance indicators or KPIs, which are always realistic and are always achievable for all stakeholders in the process. Particularly here, I'm really thinking about both from the student side and from the supplier side. In 30 years of doing and organizing language training, one thing that I've really found to be the biggest truth is that positive motivation is always the key. Well, that concludes the presentation from me today. Thank you very much for your time and your attention. Feedback is always interesting to have. And if any of you have any questions that don't get answered today, I'm available at any time by email to respond to those. So I've put on the final screen here our web address and my email address, and I'd be delighted to hear from any of you at any time. Many thanks.